Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it. Make your dreams come true.
Hello and welcome to Scree Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today we're going to be talking about pacing and all the fun stuff that goes along with it. I'm Crispy, I use she, they pronouns, and I make the comic Ghost Junk Sickness.
I'm Verathane, or Allie. I go by the pronouns she and they, and I make two webcomics, Chiralt and Witchwood.
Hello, I'm Delphina. I use she, her pronouns, and I make the comic Zombulus.
Hi, I'm Claire, also known as Clam. My pronouns are she, her. I work on the webcomic Phantomarine.
So today's topic is going to be about pacing in your webcomic. It's kind of a bit of a roller coaster of a subject because it's kind of a tough one to nail down. It relies a lot on the genre you've chosen, the scenes that you're kind of leading up to, and it's just like, well, what exactly is it? So, pacing is a term used to describe the speed at which the narrative information is delivered. In other words, how fast or how slow the story moves. If you're reading something and getting the feeling that the scenes were too rushed, or at a point they just kind of went at the blink of an eye, or that something is taking way too long to get to the point and you wish it would just speed up, those are common issues with the story's pacing. Every story is a little different. A meandering slice of life story has different pacing needs from an action thriller or a sci-fi adventure. A story whose natural pace is very slow is considered decompressed, and a story which delivers its information very quickly is called compressed. Visually speaking, manga tends to favor decompressed storytelling, with individual pages containing fairly few panels and less dialogue, while Western superhero comics tend to be extremely compressed, with pages containing more panels and a lot of dialogue balloons. Anyway, pacing's a huge subject in storytelling and has a lot of cool applications, so we're going to dive right in and talk about it. So, Thane, how do you tell if pacing is too fast or too slow, and why does it matter?
Honestly, to tell the difference between those things, I just go by feel, really. I feel like everyone kind of has their own internal barometer for the pace that their story is intended to be read at, and everybody kind of has like a default that you often will revert back to as you're writing. And when people are going through the course of their story, the pace will naturally speed up and slow down within that kind of frame or spectrum, if you will. And usually it'll be like an action scene wants to be a little bit faster, and then a slow paced, like emotional conversation scene, you might want that to be a little bit slower.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go too far, or like not far enough for the type of scene that you're writing in the type of story that you're writing, you might find, I mean, as in the definition that we got earlier, sometimes the story might seem to be dragging a little bit in one
Yeah.
section, or like it's blazing past.
Yeah.
So it matters because it affects how readers are experiencing the story itself, and how much they're enjoying it. Because sometimes if something's going too fast, like nothing is landing. I've watched movies. It's pretty common in a lot of Hollywood films these days to have extremely fast pacing, and sometimes it works and it feels tight and snappy.
Mm-hmm.
But then sometimes you'll be sitting and like everything is just kind of blowing past you in this crazy blur, and you're like, wait, slow down, hold on, what just happened there? Wait, go back, what happened there?
Like,
I
don't
don't
blink.
understand.
You'll miss it all.
I know. You like, you blink and you miss 3 plot points.
Yeah.
So it's important sometimes to like make sure you're not going too slow and boring people, but you also don't want to go too fast and
Mm-hmm.
make people miss what's happening or not really be able to comprehend the importance of a scene. Like if there's a big emotional beat, it often needs a little bit of space to kind of breathe and let it sink in,
Yeah.
so that people can understand that it's important.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, definitely. And like kind of keeping that in mind, especially with like how webcomics are, with how they're released and stuff like that. The pacing game is a hard game to play. And so it's just like you want information to also stick with your readers while getting that, impactful scene. Delphi, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, most webcomics, we work in a kind of episodic format, and getting people to connect with your characters or understand what's going on over months and years, unlike a movie, like people forget stuff. So we have to make sure that people remember what we're doing and keep their interest, and that's where kind of pacing comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I've ever read a webcomic personally where I thought, "Oh gosh, the pacing is way too fast." Like I maybe I have, I don't know. I don't think fast pacing is necessarily our problem, but slow pacing can really
Mm-hmm.
I see that quite a bit because we we ruminate on our worlds. We have like all these world building details or like things about our characters that we want to show people what's going on with them, and we love them, but a lot of times they don't serve the plot. They'll kind of take up more of your time than maybe
Mm-hmm.
you were anticipating, because maybe you thought you would be done with this comic in 2 years and now it's been 11. Like, so it just in practical terms too, pacing is a really good thing to keep in mind, to keep things brief and make sure you're spending as much time or as little time as you want to in your life so that you can meet your goals,
Mm-hmm.
whatever those might be. And I mean, not to knock anybody who wants to be spending 20 years on their comic. That's probably going to be me. Um, but but yeah, it's just a little thing to keep in mind. And just your audience's memory is probably not that great
Mm-hmm.
either. So working with your pacing, making sure that everything is succinct, and by the end of whatever arc or episode or scene, that somebody can kind of summarize it in a good way, in a clear way, and then take that knowledge on to the next scene. That's all within the realm of pacing and why
Mm-hmm.
that's important.
Mm-hmm. And you say a good point with like that clarity that you kind of need. Basically, thinking about the way that webcomics are uploaded and updated and stuff like that in traditional formats, because all four of us here our webcomics and are more in a traditional format with the page by page kind of style, as opposed to the more recently kind of popular webtoon format with the panels. I do want to talk about the difference with pacing in that momentarily, but the clarity that you kind of need to have something interesting happen in these traditional style format pages, depending on how you update your comic, because I think that coincides a lot with the pacing that you have. So it's just like, you want it to read at kind of different speeds where, you want it to read paced well enough so that your update to updates are exciting for your readers. But you also want the pacing to match when it's all together and someone decides to binge read. So it's a balance. It's, that again, that clarity is something that you definitely need, and it's definitely a balance. So I'm gonna poke you, Clam, with the same question about how do you tell if, if that pacing's just too fast or too slow?
It was so funny hearing Delphi say, I don't think any webcomic has pacing that's too fast, and I'm just like raising my hand over here, like it's me, I know it's me.
Oh no!
No, it's something where I feel like, oh gosh, I struggled at the beginning of making Phantom Marine, figuring out pacing, because I think, like everybody has said, it's something where you have to go by instinct past a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have that instinct. This is my first webcomic, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. Let's just draw some pages and have fun. And I think I realized at a certain point, I was just like, I need to think about this a little bit more. And I've actually changed my pacing a lot over the years.
Mm-hmm.
I know that Part of my problem with pacing originally was actually a very functional thing. The printer that I wanted to use to make printed saddlebound copies of the comic for VanCaf specifically limited the page count to 40 pages. So I was just like, okay, that's a good metric for the number of pages I want to have in this chapter as like a self-contained story. But and I think it works really well for chapter 1. But I know for chapter 2 and a bit of chapter 3, it is smushed. Like everything, I've gotten the comment before where, people say you have so many, not really so much words on a page, but like bubbles on a page, or so many things happen on one page. And I did my best to alleviate that at some kind of intervals, but really it was a lot of me trying to fit everything I wanted to into that page count. And now that I'm basically headed towards a volume rather than individual chapters, I am not restricted. So I've gone from basically 30-page chapters to, I think this one is going to be about 80 pages. and it feels much better pacing wise. I look back on old chapters and I'm like, it works, but gosh, I remember all the things I had to cut. I remember all these scenes that I was excited about doing, things that maybe it would have kept people from the main story for a little too long, but I was like, this would have been really nice to see. Now I feel like, it's nice now. I'm kind of back on a main story pathway after diverting for a bit, so I can let things breathe, let these characters just be themselves. I wanted to give the time that these characters deserve.
Yeah.
Because I know from a fan perspective, if these scenes go by too quickly, like I would be unhappy. I would want these characters to be able to interact and, show me this world and show me the details of it. So I am absolutely one where I've learned the most about pacing in terms of all the things I've learned about webcomics, but I still have a ways to go. So yeah, I have slowed on down and it feels good.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good point to kind of like, slowing down the story in a way that gets your readers to kind of gravitate and hold on to the characters that you're introducing. Because, when you have these stories that are grandiose in their world building and the plot and everything is just kind of thick in what it is, it does take a moment to kind of step back and just be like, okay, like appreciate the small details, let them kind of play in the sandbox that is this story, this little web comic, and kind of explore on their own. So I think that you've done a really good job with like a lot of the visual keys, also to kind of balance out what is going on a page. And I think that that's something that's really to be considered with a lot of pacing. And also that point that you had made about listening to the readers making kind of comments being like, well, this kind of felt a little bit too slow or too fast. And I think that those are kind of key moments to pay attention to how to go about this or to gauge it, because that's something that we always kind of talk about in some of our other episodes on this podcast, is that it's hard for us as the creators to kind of step back and evaluate it from an unbiased perspective, to kind of be like, wow, how can I really tell if I'm balancing this pacing well, and stuff like that. And with that kind of leads to my next question that I do want to ask. Thane, how did you approach the pacing in your webcomic, and like what kind of led to that decision?
It's really been a comfort zone kind of thing, because my comics themselves were very inspired in part by manga, and then at one point, kind of a formative moment, I guess, in school, I studied some stuff by Jeff Smith, and I saw some of his process where he always uses a 6-panel format for every page. And I imitated that right out of the gate when I was starting Chiralt. And it kind of helped give me a framework for, here's how to structure a single comic page as a unit of a story and string these together, and then you can modify them to add impact or reduce it in some places. Like if you need to really bring more attention to a moment, you can have the whole top row of the page be like one panel, because if you're going through with almost the same grid on most pages, like 6 panel 6 panel 6 panel, and then you have a page that has 3 panels or a page that has 9 panels, it'll feel different to the reader speed wise as they're reading it. And as a beginning artist who kind of was just starting my first comic, it was really helpful to have that kind of framework to pin my work around and be like, oh, I might not know how to make a comic, but I can draw 6 boxes on a page and then draw things inside of those. And that definitely affected how I think about pacing and how I structure my scenes and like the pages within them. Another thing that is kind of relevant to this is that there's 2 kinds of pacing that people talk about. There's like the internal pacing of a scene, which is how many panels you use for something and like how many pages a scene takes to make. And then there's the pacing over the course of the whole story itself, like how long do you spend in the peaks and valleys of the storytelling. And they both in both cases, you kind of have to at some point make a decision or get a gut feeling for how you like to do it and what suits your story. And at a certain point, you might need to step back and start editing it. So with my first comic, I didn't really start doing that until maybe a good halfway through an 11-year process.
Oh, wow.
Because I was kind of doing that discovery writing thing, like just feeling things out as I went. And I was trying to keep it episodic at first, which I think was a good strategy for me at the time. Like I'll just make little shorts, almost self-contained adventures. And having that 6-panel page structure also helped to kind of give me a framework and keep on track to some extent. But I didn't really start thinking about the whole story as having a pace of its own until much later. Whereas with my second comic, I've been working in very large batches of pages, like often a whole chapter at a time, and I'll sketch the whole thing before I start inking it, which gives me a chance to finish it and then look at what I've done and maybe figure out if I need to edit things. I'll show it to other readers and get critique, as mentioned in our critique episode earlier in this very podcast. But it gives me a chance to see if parts of it are going too slow or too quickly, and then I know if I need to add pages or remove pages, like combine scenes with one another. And but yeah, the actual pacing itself, I landed on just by a combination of instinct and the things that I was reading affecting what I liked to do.
Yeah, like kind of leading up to like that inspiration that you're kind of like, I think that's a great like thing to have as a reminder in the back of your head, being like, oh gosh, I was really inspired by, I don't know, the way that Cardcaptor Sakura by Clamp kind of paced out their story with things happening quite quickly. It got me through the story. I still cared about the characters because those moments went slower. The action went pretty fast, and you know what I mean? Like, my story is kind of based off of that, or I'm more inspired by, you know, XYZ. I think it's kind of a good thing to keep in mind to keep yourself in check with a lot of those things, to kind of be like, you know, it worked for me. I enjoyed it as a reader. So if I can aim my boat that way as a writer, that's a good little reminder. Delphina, what do you think? How do you approach the pacing in your webcomic?
Yeah, so Thane brings up an interesting point that there is like a difference between like the internal pacing of a page or an update and then like the entire arc or chapter.
Yes.
So for a page, my pages usually average about 6 panels a page, maybe sometimes going up to 8 or 9 if I'm really trying to do like a montage of things to get through something quickly. And then they usually, last panel has a beat at the end of some sort. So I try to end it on a character moment or just something that summarizes the feeling that you should have at the end of the update. Are you asking a question? Are you laughing at something? Are you realizing something important, any of those things, like that's kind of the period at the end of your sentence, or the question mark or the exclamation point.
Yes.
Just that will tell you the mood that you want to take from the entire page. So that last panel is really important to me, that I found, and really making sure that I alternate that a little bit is important, because if you're reading a paragraph and everything has a question mark after it, like that's people are going to start getting tired of asking questions. You need
Yes.
to have a payoff. So that's another way of kind of thinking about your pacing. How are you alternating, the questions you're asking and the payoff that you're getting, and the character moments and the advancement of the plot. Those are all kind of the things that I try to keep in mind page to
Mm.
page. Um, Longer term, I find about a month per scene is a good pace for me. It's just long enough where I can get something done, and that's about 8 pages for me, because
Mhm.
I update twice a week. And I can get something done, but it's not too fast. I can get a moment down, and again, it kind of formula. I think of it like a paragraph of sentences. I have 8 pages, 8 sentences in this paragraph, and I want that scene to end on a page that really sums up the mood of, here's everything that you should have taken from this, kind of your thesis statement, so that even if they don't remember every single little detail of every single thing that happened in the pages, they remember, oh, this is bad,
Mhm.
or oh, this is looking up. So those are kinds of some things that I keep in mind, just getting that gut feeling into your readers' hearts and minds. um, the the longer thing that we're talking about in terms of editing and making sure that your chapters are reading the way you want them, that I really do have to have a little space away from the whole arc. I need to
Mhm.
get everything, get the episode or scene to some sort of conclusion, so I can look at the whole thing with fresh
Yes.
eyes, because that first draft or iteration you get down is always going to be a little stream of conscious. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing, because that's where you just throw all your Lego bricks on the floor and see what kind of pieces. Oh, I can really use that like angly piece for something cool or something like that. Like don't restrict yourself. Like really give yourself the freedom to explore for sure, but just know that you're not going to be using all the pieces on the floor, and some of them are going to go back in the box.
Yes.
And yeah, so when I do get through a scene or get through a chapter, and maybe I'm preparing for print or something else, I tend to notice there's a lot of little nuggets that might have been cute jokes or fluff, or something that I thought was going to be much more important than it was. Sometimes I'll put in like foreshadowing that I think I'm
Mhm.
going to take somewhere, and then I don't. And so that just kind of gets sanded off with the sandpaper of editing.
Mhm.
The other problem that I might have is that sometimes things are too compressed. Sometimes I wanted an emotion to come through, and people really didn't get it because I didn't give it enough space.
Mhm.
So sometimes there's some connective tissue that I need to add there, another page or another couple of things, so I can make sure I get the punctuation marks where I want them. So I
Yeah.
put a little sticky note in those parts to either compress or decompress those scenes. Yeah, so that's my general overview of the approach. But it is a lot of gut feeling. It is a lot of asking people, what did
Mhm.
you get out of this scene? um, and listening to my readers and listening to my beta readers, and really honing in on what parts I want to keep, expand, contract, whatever.
Mhm. I think it's like you make an excellent point about the fact that you're just like, I won't understand or fully comprehend the pacing that I laid out until the scene or the moment is kind of done. And I think that that's important for webcomic creators to kind of, be at peace with the fact that there is going to be editing that you will be doing with this comic, just because the nature of how it's presented and how things kind of go long term.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that definitely down the line, we're definitely going to be covering editing as a whole, because I think it's very important. And I think pacing is definitely, something that's also highly, kind of tackled in the editing aspect of webcomic creating. So, you make some awesome points there, Delphi, and something to really consider is just stepping back, looking at it as a whole, because when you have new readers, and you're always going to have new readers because webcomics are awesome, people will binge to get to that point. And again, like I said previously, they're going to see, those pacing either flaws or excellences that you put down. So, keep in mind, and I think definitely reread your work every other month, every few months in between, and kind of, reassociate stuff with what you did. But before I keep going on, I also want to hear, Clam, tell me about how you kind of worked pacing into your comic as well.
Clam doesn't have too many more things to add because everybody else did a great job. But I was thinking about, I've already talked about the whole, being limited to 40 pages thing.
Yes.
I know that one thing for me that changed over the course of making the comic was actually my update schedule. And that has created, an interesting kind of shift in my brain. Because one of the reasons why my pages were so packed in the early years was mostly because it wasn't the way it was like very, very early on, because I was not sharing the comic with anybody. I was posting it and I had like one friend that was reading it. I didn't have social media. I didn't want to tell anybody until I was like, okay, this is not a mess anymore. Let's post it.
Mm-hmm.
So for the first 3 years or so, it was basically an experiment. But I wanted to kind of stick to this idea that, I was doing a one update per week sort of situation, just because that was what I was comfortable with. And I wanted to make it so that you end on something, like Delphi said, a panel where somebody's going to be like, ooh, I feel something, I want to read more. But also something where if you are reading one page per week, which can be a slog if you're desperately waiting for the next page, you want to give people enough of a meal with that page. And that was kind of my thinking. Like, yes, it's a packed page, but this is what people are going to, this is what's going to satisfy a reader over the course of a 7-day period. And I think there's no shame in that. Like, it just kind of was what I was comfortable with. It was what I thought would work best. And it led to some really cool stuff. So I have no problem with it. But I have shifted over to a 2-day-a-week update schedule. And now I feel so much less pressure to like deliver an entire, plate of nachos, every single time. I can, it actually makes things easier because I put fewer things on a page in general, which actually gives me more pages. So it increases my buffer. So it's kind of this interesting switchover where I'm no longer restricted by that page count, length situation. So I really I still wish that I could update, every day per week just to make it happen faster. But this is way more comfortable where, I can put that effort into really sticking the emotional landing, or making sure, like, if I ever had that inkling on a page before where I'm just like, it's a little scrunched, I wish I could add more, but I simply can't. Like, now I listen to that. I'm doing that. My current chapter, I actually just went through and I was feeling really not great about one particular part of it, because I was just like, these characters are meeting for the first time and talking. I want them to, take the time that they need. I would love to get back into, big time story stuff as quickly as possible. But I actually went through and I added like 6 more pages, and it feels so much better. And I'm just like, I'm so glad I did that, because some of those pages are wonderful and I love them. So it's something where that particular mindset has changed for me. And I still see, comics do both versions of it. And some people, do update 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times per week, and they can really play with that pacing. But for me, apart from the page restriction thing, getting a little bit more loosey goosey with the page updates. It's been a really interesting kind of experiment, and I feel better about it. It feels nicer for me.
Yeah, that's so interesting though that you went from 1 page a week to 2 pages a week, and that actually gave you more buffer instead of eating through your buffer
Mhm,
faster. That's
mhm.
really fascinating because you don't think that seems counterintuitive, but you're absolutely right. Just having that extra space, you can decompress a little more and maybe not have to squeeze so much art in every single update.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was exactly the thing. Like now, there's a lot of things that are making this chapter easier because I can reuse backgrounds and things. It's basically they're all in one room the entire time, but just lots of things happen in that room. But yeah, having that sort of, I guess, yeah, those shortcuts, it makes it feel like kind of like how I would have wanted my chapter 2 and 3 to be back in the day. And I'm just like, I finally reached that pace where I can do this faster, and I knew
Mhm.
that I would get here, but it's rewarding. It's really, really nice.
Yeah. And to have like those moments where, the moment breathes and, your readers, I feel like, are definitely going to appreciate that more because, when you have like such integral information happening, I think to kind of space it out and, really kind of like lay down that impact is, beneficial to both you and the reader, as you said, building your buffer with that. But pacing affects a lot of stuff, and it always depends even on the scene. Like sometimes you will want to condense a scene to be quite quick depending on what exactly the context is. I know for Ghost Junk, we had originally decided, or not originally, like it was set in stone, like this is how we were going to do it. Was us being inspired by the manga Trigun. We were like, that's what we want. We just want to go be nerds and be mangakas. And so a lot of the pacing reflects that kind of thing. It's fast paced, things happen and stuff like that. So it was really meant for print to kind of be digested in that. So when we update pages onto the website, there's not one page isn't going to be like the other. Our more impactful pages are going to have that punch, but we're still going to have the moments that lead up to it. Now, in certain instances, how to kind of work around that, because you will have a quote unquote dull page compared to something more exciting happening next, is that if we're having a moment where we want the readers to sustain tension or a mood or atmosphere, what we do is we prepare a week where we call them Ghost Junk Bombs, and we're like, okay, there's a really intense moment about to happen in our story, and I don't want the momentum to end. So we've planned ahead and had our buffers so that we could release a page a day for that week. And when it got to the moment that, granted that impact, it was, like I said, it was sustained, and it was like, it was well received, and it was just, it felt good to kind of have that. So just kind of like thinking about how you release your pages and stuff like that.
Hi, Delphina here to talk to you about Chiralt, the finished comic by Awesome Screen Tone's co-host Verathane. It's a high fantasy comic about a little girl who gets shrunk to squirrel-sized, the demon she enlists to help her out, and the problems they face along the way. You can get the whole collection in print for $95 right now, or as ebooks for $15 over at gumroad.com/Verathane. It's completely finished and absolutely amazing, so go get your own copy. That's gumroad.com/Verathane. Thanks so much for supporting us and enjoy the episode.
Kind of makes me wonder about the format as well with webtoons. We have the scroll format and they kind of upload in episodes. So I feel like, pacing would definitely be different and affected differently as opposed to more traditional media with a page by page update with X amount of panels and stuff like that. So I kind of want to lead into another question that kind of relates to that is the fundamental difference between pacing a comic destined for print or as a one-time release as an ebook versus publishing on the web. Thane, let's talk about that.
There are as many differences as you want, is my feeling on that matter. Because my comics personally, I've been kind of approaching them by pacing them at my own kind of comfort level, which is inherently kind of with print in mind. Because the way I sort of see it, once you have put it up, there's only going to be one day where that update is like brand new. And then as soon as the next one goes up, now it's part of the archive, and readers are going to be experiencing that in one big long reading binge. And there's definitely ways to optimize the reader's cumulative experience following a comic for years and going back to it every single day to like check their bookmark or their RSS, or like they get pinged on the platform or whatever to see what the newest update is. There are techniques to optimize that for sure. Personally, my comics are paced as if they're destined for print, and I'm always kind of thinking about how people are going to be experiencing it in the binge read, because that kind of, now that I've finished my first comic, Chirrut, and I'm working on the second one, that first comic, it only exists as an archive binge now. There will never again be another, well, I guess unless I, put it up on a new platform and start posting it again. But people will always be able to go back to the homepage and just read the entire thing all at once with no wait for the next page. And that's kind of been I always want to optimize that because I want it to be a fun experience for the people who decide to buy the books. I have seen some comics that definitely, there's ways to kind of try to create an even experience, I guess, where each update kind of contains a little bit of all the things that readers might want. And I feel like that's where platforms like Webtoon and Tapas, where they have very long updates, they kind of excel at that, because each update is going to contain a pretty sizable chunk of story, and it'll have a certain amount of emotions and heartstring tugging or action or comedy or whatever things are like in enough of a mix that the readers will come away feeling satisfied, even if it's just the one update that they get that week. It's a little tougher when you're working with a single page of a print format comic, where you have, the panels laid out. But that approach of speeding up the update schedule during really tense or cool sequences is a really neat way to kind of handle that. I tend to update faster, like 2 or 3 times a week for print format webcomics, because I think 1 page a week is sort of the standard minimum amount. And maybe that helps the fact that my stories are inherently paced for print, that it's less that the low points are less dull for the readers because they know they're going to get another update soon.
Yeah, it's honestly it's really hard to balance that, but I think it's good to keep in mind what the goal is at the end of the day for you as the creator of that. And I know that you printing it, you must have felt that difference finishing Chirrut, reading through Chirrut and being like, wow, okay, so this is the pacing when I was uploading it as a webcomic. Now it's in print. Did you feel differently about that when you kind of, saw it as a book and reread it again?
Not as differently as I guess I could have. There were definitely some points where if I read over the story, I could kind of tell this is a part of the story where I ran out of buffer and I started kind of scrambling to write pages the day before they went up. And so a scene that could have taken 2 or 3 pages if I'd been on my game takes 6 pages because I'm kind of figuring it out as I'm going. But all things considered, while there are a few uneven points in the pacing, it comes off more natural than I had expected, which I'm pretty happy about.
That's actually really awesome. That definitely shows I know that you were saying that you were exploring the story as you were kind of going, but I don't know. I think it definitely it paid off in the end. I think you knew at the back of your mind that you're like, I was still inspired by XYZ, and
yeah,
it definitely goes to show that it was still there as something fundamental when you were talking about the 6 panels.
Yeah, I think having these structures and like rules for myself, even if I never kind of made them official, really helped in keeping things kind of moving fairly smoothly.
Yeah. Yeah. Delphi, I also kind of want to ask, like, how do you feel about, like, that fundamental difference between the pacing of print comics and web comics?
Oh gosh. Yeah, it's well, we just have such an interesting medium in webcomics. It is so different and unique. Um because you think of like a movie or something like that, you're watching it and you spend 2 hours or something with these characters and then you're done with them.
Mhm.
And so web comics are sort of more episodic. We've got kind of more of a TV approach or something like that, where people are getting to know your characters and your world over years and
Yes.
years. And there's a real opportunity there in your pacing and in that mindset to really give your characters time to shine and get in to tug people's heartstrings. So I really love that aspect. I think that's something I play up a lot in my own web comics, that I don't think you get as well when you've got like a printed volume and
Mhm.
you read through it, because that doesn't take you as long. So you don't connect to the characters as much. I do sort of favor that, the web pacing versus the print pacing, but I think my comic works in print as well.
Mhm.
Um, I think the webtoon and tapis sort of model in terms of episodes, it's similar, but again, it's just like, instead of posting a sentence, 3 sentences a week, now you're posting, a paragraph a
Mhm.
week. And that's just like, there is a slight difference. I have been trying to adapt Zombulus for Webtoon. And I decided, because I had this massive archive, what I was going to do was I was going to shove as many pages as physically possible onto every single thing. They only give you 20. They give you
Oh.
20 graphics and then you're done. So I can't just like drop the entire thing during one episode. I do have to kind of structure it, and it's about like 10 pages that I can fit in one episode if I really try.
Oh, that's
Um
interesting.
yeah. Yeah. And I am reformatting it so it kind of works with the scroll stuff a little better. If I just wanted to drop the pages in there wholesale, I wouldn't have to do that. But
Mhm.
um yeah, and that has been an interesting exercise, because it definitely changes how the scene reads and
Yes.
what uh, I have to kind of think about what I give more time to, what I give more space to, because people aren't spending as much time getting to know these characters, or thinking about these characters, or interacting in the comments and saying this person is doing this thing and I wonder what they're going to do next. There's kind of like that space where people get to explore their ideas between your one update and another update.
Mhm.
And I think that's just so cool. And you will have that if you do issues or if you do printed volumes. So it's just kind of a matter of scale, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting that you bring up, how you can upload to Webtoon/Tapaz. And, talking about even what Thane said before with that structure is that I think that, the pacing works really well on those kind of platforms because it kind of already has that structure that you have to follow. So, you can't, I mean, you can, but you shouldn't, probably not, but take like a good 30 years having a scene where grandpa gets up from the, I don't know, rocking chair to pour himself some tea, and it takes just so long. Like, you kind of just have to get to the point with a lot of things that they have on Webtoons. Tapaz kind of model, of course, within reason and within, staying true to the theme or the ambience that you want with the stuff. But I think that's interesting that they kind of have a predestined, almost like, here's the formula and here's the restrictions. And I think restrictions do kind of help people do that. But definitely that difference with the web versus print, is kind of interesting as far as pacing goes. How do you feel about it, Clam?
It's really interesting because I did not know of the existence of Webtoon and Tapas when I was first starting this comic. I'm a bit of a hermit in terms of the webcomic community, or at least I was, and I've come out of my shell. But back then, yeah, I had no idea. So I really didn't know. I didn't have a frame of reference for that. And I actually, there's a webcomic, not just a webcomic, actually, just comics in general, collective in Vancouver here called Cloudscape. It's really cool. If you're in the Vancouver area, check them out. They're wonderful. I love them. I went there, yeah, for the first time, and I showed them the printed version of my first chapter, and they were like, "Oh, do you have it on Tapas or Webtoons?" And I'm like, "What's a Tapas?" But it was so interesting because then I came home and I'm just like, there's this whole world that I was not aware of at all, and I've really kind of approached it as like an outsider learning. You know, I've got my comic as its own format where I'm just like, I do ultimately want it to be a book, and I want it to be relatively book paced, but it's really cool to jump around and see, you know, what does this comic feel like in a scroll format? What does it feel like in a page format? It's actually very interesting because I've read both the online and the printed versions of Ghost Junk, and then the first chapter of Witchwood, and it's always a different experience, you know, reading it online versus in print. And I know that you know, you can tell when a story is meant more for print, but I do feel like, you know, there's always going to be a little bit of a trade-off.
Yes.
I know one of the things that I want to warn people about is like, make sure that your page loading is not that long.
Yes.
Because like,
Yes.
it's a huge thing where you know, you might be pacing it like a book, but people can't turn the page like a book.
Yes.
So if people are waiting for that loading, that might stop them. So it's something where you need to think about it technically, but it also was interesting on my own stuff, getting it printed and reading it with relatively fresh eyes. It's something where, you know, I feel the web pacing more than, you know, anything else, because I do still feel that sense of like, I have to do a page a week and pack it full, and you end each page on like a mini cliffhanger or a question or something like that. So you do get kind of this stop and start feeling a tiny bit, but at the same time, the trade-off for me was having a full view of the art. And I know it's not, you know, the main thing for every webcomic, but I know for me, like I throw my entire soul into the art. God help me. But it's something where, you know, if you're looking at it on your web page, you're still going to have to scroll to look at the whole page.
Yes.
If you're looking at it on your phone, you're not going to see the whole thing. But when you look at it in a book and you open each page and you're just like, oh, nom, 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 there it is. It's all right there. Like that's a different experience too. So you think about it in terms of, yeah, the technical side of things, you know, I guess, you know, scrolling, I think there's some scroll comics where I am jealous of how they can use a page and they can, you know, make things, just because the action, you know, the way that you traverse a page is so action based. You're scrolling, you can create this sense of movement. So these people that do action scenes where they make things, you know, go sideways, and they have like a shoom effect that goes like, you know, basically the equivalent of like 2 websites height, and I'm just like, this is so cool. I wish, I kind of wonder if there was like an AU where I had done a scroll comic, what could I have done with that. And it also it's going to be interesting seeing some of those big webtoons that are going to be printed now, what that format is going to be like, because I'm very fascinated by that. I think it's going to be a different experience. Just the nature of switching mediums is always going to make something a little bit different. And I think that that's to be celebrated in a lot of cases, not necessarily feared.
I agree. And I'm kind of excited. I know a couple of artists who are going to be going from the webtoon format to printing some years in the future. And I know with your example that you'd said reading Ghost Junk and Witchwood, the experiences will be different because the format allows for those experiences to be different. I mean, uh, the Behemoth Homestuck webcomic has that specific need to be on the web to enjoy what it is. So, when it kind of translates to printing, it's just like, where's the impact that you would get from the web based, format that it was meant to be? So, keeping that in mind with, what do you want, for the long run to have the readers experience that?
It's so funny that you bring up Homestuck though, because I was actually hired by Andrew Hussey's team to format Problem Sleuth, which is the thing he did before
No
Homestuck
way!
I
for
didn't know
print.
that.
Yeah,
What?
I
Whoa.
did a couple of volumes for him. So check those out. Look at my name on there. My claim to fame, but yeah. So it was interesting though because like everything was animated gifs.
Mhm.
Everything was just like this like paragraph of text and this block of thing, and I had to think about, okay, how do I adapt this to an interesting print format? And there's some real fun things you can do. I actually have a lot of fun with print layout. Because I broke out the animation frames for some of the things, kind of tried to figure out how much space each thing could take up. And then when something really cool happened, I would make that a full page spread and maybe overlay the text on part of it. And it was just this like cool little puzzle that you got to play with. So just like as a note of encouragement, if you're doing something for web, if you're doing something that's not necessarily page format, um, there are ways, there are
Mhm.
tricks, and it can actually be a lot of fun. Even like, don't give up hope that like, oh no, I could never print this. There's
Yeah.
never a way that this could work in print. There are ways.
Mhm.
There are definitely ways.
Yeah. Like, essentially, comics are kind of a collage of these images, sequential collages, but regardless, even some of them just kind of like, constructing them in a way where your eye leads to get to the point, kind of is the basis of what you have. So, hearing that you got to basically have something deconstructed and reconstructed almost as a new kind of comic is really, really cool, Delphi. Like, oh my god, I did not know that.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was such a fun project. I mean, and I like that kind of stuff. Some people don't like that kind of stuff, but yeah, it's just very interesting. And of course, it affects like we're saying, every time you change formats like that, there's going to be something that's lost, but something that's gained, and you kind of have to think about gut wise what direction you want to go with that.
Yeah, and like kind of like, keeping in mind with the pacing of the original and keeping true to how you experienced it is something to definitely keep in mind because as we said, that's going to change when you kind of play with format, and that's going to change with how you experience the story. So I kind of want to ask, like, if you feel a scene is moving too fast or too slow, or some reader has been kind of pointing this out to you or something like that, like what do you do about that? Like, how do you remedy that?
So, at the very simplest, most surface level, the obvious solution to this particular question is if something is going too fast, add a few more pages to kind of spread the sequence out, and if it's going too slow, you find ways to shorten it. But I mean, first you have to identify like what kind of scene it is and what sort of solution is going to be appropriate at that point in the story. When it comes to pacing, my personal kind of bugbear, I guess, is that I tend to make things very decompressed and to take a long time, which is why all of my stories are like 1,000 pages long. So yeah,
Here, here.
it's my setting. I don't know. It's my groove, I guess. Um, but I've been trying to tighten things up and compress things just a little more. Like I don't want to make a story that I feel is rushed, but wherever I can see a place to shorten something instead of expand it, I try to take it. So I think a lot about ways of condensing information and making things get communicated a little quicker, because I feel like it kind of suits everybody. Like the readers will be happy to see
Mhm.
cool things happen faster. Um, so if scenes are going like too slowly, there's one like solution, which is that you start cutting like lines of dialogue, or like make the dialogue shorter, or remove actions. Like if you're showing a character like reaching out to drink a cup of water, you might be able to do that in like just one panel. Just show them
Yes.
drinking. You don't necessarily need to show them reaching out with their hand and then grabbing the mug and then lifting it up. Like there's steps that you might be able to cut out from your scene. And then on kind of
Yes.
a larger overview level, like say you have a whole chapter and your chapter is too long and you want to make it be less pages in general, but there's like not a specific scene that's jumping out. You might have like one scene where the characters are talking about something that they're planning to do next, and then the next scene is them doing the thing, like sneaking around in a hallway, breaking a bunch of locks or something like that. Not that that's from any kind of real experience. Anyway, you might be able to combine the scenes, like omit the planning stage and just show them executing the plan. Or if the conversation had some interesting emotional beat, maybe they have that part while they're in the process of doing the action, because you'll make both
Yes.
scenes more interesting by adding just a little bit more kind of flavor to the scene. They're not just sitting in a room kind of chatting with nothing happening, and
Hmm.
they're not just like skulking around in total silence. You have a little bit of character development at the same time as the action. And the bonus is
Yeah.
it takes place in less pages. So you don't have to draw as much. And when you go to print, it doesn't cost as much. Hooray.
Yeah. I like that though. Like overlaying two things that are happening is an excellent solution because you're still having the thing that you don't want to cut in there, but they're still getting to the point. Like I love
It's one
that
of those things that you
solution.
definitely kind of need to be working ahead at least a little
Yes.
bit to kind of see, because if you just kind of started writing scene one and then realize that you also need scene two, like you're kind of in it now. But if you can,
Mhm.
edit that
Mhm.
later, or like just write ahead of where you are, you can kind of plan for these things a little more.
Oh yeah, definitely writing ahead. Again, we're going to be doing an editing episode and that's going to be, I don't know, the jewel in there.
Heck yeah.
Definitely planning with that stuff to kind of tackle these things because, it can be quite a behemoth to kind of understand as far as that's concerned. I did want to ask, Delphi, how do you kind of feel like, if the scene is going too fast or too slow, like, how do you deal with that in your comic?
Okay. Well, so I have a couple different tools in my toolbox. Sometimes I will abbreviate something, kind of like Thane said, see how many panels you can get rid of and have things still make sense.
Hmm.
Like a lot of times you don't need to show someone reaching out and drinking the water, like Thane said. But if the water's not that important, maybe you just don't even show the cup of
Yeah.
water at all. Maybe you just say, "Well, I'm hydrated now. Let's go."
Yeah.
Um, like is the water important? You
Hmm.
get to decide exactly how important all these details are. And another great one was combining stuff. This is good if you have folks in a room, they're having a conversation and they're not doing anything else. See if something else can happen
Hmm.
like at the same time. You can cut stuff. You can sometimes just get rid of things. This one's hard. Um, but a lot of times what happens to me a lot is I get stuck with discovery writing, which is something I call like stuff that I've written that is part of plot. It is part of canon. But ultimately, it was me trying to figure out my characters. It was me trying to figure out my world or my mood. Um, and once I've established that, and once I look back, a lot of times I find I really don't need it, or the readers thought it was boring. I think a lot of world building, like this is how the gods made the world sort
Yeah.
of things, fall into this category of discovery writing where it was important for me to write, it was important for me to know, and it informs what I'm doing. But it's scaffolding.
Yes.
It is scaffolding to a larger building, and once the building is built, you do not need the scaffolding anymore.
Mhm.
So that's when you kind of you can tell it's not adding anything. Other things have supported this now, and you can cut it out.
Mhm.
One of the things that like Thane said, you were working with two different things in a comic. You've got your words and you've got your art, and you can use both of them to do different things. You can kind of do a double duty approach. So like you can show physical surroundings, that kind of sets the mood for like how tidy is their laundry pile, are there cracks in the wall, are their shoes beat up, what kind of potions are behind them.
Mhm.
There's always something a place can tell you, and that can be a great tool for conveying some of this world building stuff when you don't want to devote the pages to someone like saying, well, as you know, we have horses here.
Yeah.
Like, just show a horse. Just show a horse in the background. Now you'll know this is the level of technology they are. This is the way they get around. This is, they're fancy horses. They're plain looking horses. Like that's all you need.
Mhm.
But in addition to physical surroundings, you can also show emotional
Yes.
surroundings. Like if someone's feeling really touchy about a subject, what are they visualizing in their head? Drawing that out of their imagination and putting it on the page can be a really powerful insight into how they perceive the subject. I've seen some gorgeous stuff. I like just amazing things from comic artists who like they're showing a mental illness or they're showing some sort of like trauma or really joyful stuff, and they're able to put that emotion into the
Mhm.
art,
Mhm.
and you don't even have to devote pages to like them saying I feel sad, because you see them like
Yeah.
sitting here and having this emotional breakdown. That's just like it's the coolest thing. And then yeah, just character interaction too. I'm a big sucker for just showing uh, people drying the dishes together, or
Yeah.
somebody ripping the label off a beer bottle, or just doing something with the environment that shows how they're feeling, if they're gripping something very tensely, or if they're just kind of lounging around in the bathtub while they're talking to you with cucumbers over their eyes. Like there's a lot of things that you can do that don't interrupt the conversation but show that. Um, and then one other thing that I think about a lot is what I call dropping the shroud of your secrets and mysteries, because a lot of times I'm trying to build up foreshadowing or mystery or something like that, but it can get confusing for people because you're keeping your cards too close to your chest, and
Yes.
there's a difference between mystery and confusion.
Yes.
um, People might not pick up everything you put down, um, but you need to have them pick up something eventually, or
Mhm.
else they're just going to disengage.
Yeah.
So two figures talking in the alley about, what did you do about him? I don't know. What should we do about him? Sometimes that won't inspire the intrigue you want, and the better option is just saying who he is
Mhm.
and what you planned on doing with him. Um, just err on the side of being obvious, cut to the chase when
Yeah.
possible, give people's names, show people's faces, connect it back to later characters and events. That will make it more
Yes.
interesting, not less interesting.
Yeah.
Because there's always going to be more mysteries. There's always going to be more things that to pick up. And that'll just save you some time from having to explain it later when maybe your readers have already forgotten what that conversation
Yeah.
was even
Yeah.
doing. There's always going to be another opportunity, so don't be afraid of showing your cards.
Yeah. And it's definitely like, previously in our spoilers episode, we were kind of like, give your, readers a little bit of a treat or something to kind of like, connect to and stuff like that. And I know that there's definitely writers who feel like, the mystery of not giving any information at all is more intriguing, but it can actually affect the pacing when nothing's being dropped, and it actually feels like a drag when you're not getting answers and everything just feels like a question, and it feels like it's longer even if it's not. So, dropping information definitely affects pacing. Clam was saying like dropping or having something interesting in her pages with each one when she was doing the 1 page a week kind of thing. And it's just like, something was being answered some way or another. It doesn't have to be every single page, and not that Clam did that either. But just having that intrigue, having the world being built behind you, like you were saying, Delphi, but also having something come across, because you made a really good point with the fact that it's just like, you don't want to interrupt that conversation because you kind of want something to be happening to an extent, one way or another, where it be ambience or action or anything like that. Like, you don't want to interrupt the flow. But when there's nothing in the flow and it feels like there's nothing actually happening, you're definitely on your ways to becoming a little bit of a slog to kind of get through, as far as that's concerned. I did want to ask Claire, us all kind of talking about this, like, how do you specifically kind of deal with yourself, with moving too fast or moving absolutely too slow, or even not even like in your own work, or how do you approach it when even critiquing somebody else's as well?
Gosh, I, again, I'm running out of things to say. I know that I've already touched on, putting in more pages and things
Yes.
like that. One thing that I ran into that I know that not everybody does, in terms of both a pacing and an editing thing, as I think most people know here, my story got a brand new prologue. So I got the critique from several people over the years saying that I started things too quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'd basically drop people into a scene with very little information, basically just a visual saying like, if you like this, then you're probably going to like this comic. But a lot of people were just like, where are we? What are we doing? Who are these people? There's a lot of people. Who are these characters?
Yeah.
So, it was something where it's a unique pacing situation where it's, you're throwing people in right then and there. Like it's too fast all at once, like even from the start. So I had to bite the bullet and I added 12 new pages. I originally drew out 10 and then that expanded to 12 because 2 of them needed some more breathing room unto themselves because that's an action scene and you want to see, all the details of that and have it be impactful. And if you've read it, it's the part where all the bad things happen. Yeah. And it's really actually helped me, that initial 12 page, like, okay, I'll do this, it's going to be painful but I'll do it, has really it's helped me self edit going forward, because especially having somebody else say multiple times like, I don't know what's going on, it makes me kind of do a mental check of like, can I tell what's going on here, am I getting the right feeling, all these different things. So it's an interesting situation. I've experimented a lot with pacing over the years and I've learned a lot of different things. And it's so funny how, the biggest problem with pacing was right at the beginning for a lot of people. And I know that, there's some people where that's perfectly fine. Like they got dropped in and they had no problem just kind of saying, I'm along for this ride no matter what happens. But it was interesting. It was definitely an information thing where, sometimes your pacing is leaving out that important information and you could be losing readers right from the start. So, double check, don't neglect the beginning either. Yes. Like you can talk about things, all the way through chapter by chapter, but if you do start out too quickly or even too slowly, if your story takes 500 pages to get started, then you might want to figure out, some editing with that too. So, but I think we're going to talk about editing another time.
Oh my goodness, that's going to be a whole other absolute juicy episode. Like even talking about editing now, I'm getting excited.
I am too. I'm full of fear because I'm remembering just like, oh no, you get presented with that critique and you're just like, well, we're in for it now. Here we go.
Oh
And I
my
know
god.
you can speak to that too.
Oh, it's still going. The battle is still, we're still waging war here.
It never ends. It never ends with webcomics because you
No.
can always edit them.
Well, I think that's pretty much a chicken salad Caesar wrap. As far as pacing is concerned, definitely keeping in mind as a writer and a reader, what you want kind of at the end, and your goal for it as a format is definitely kind of first and foremost to help you kind of like write it and kind of plan ahead and step back when you can. Read your work when you can. Have some beta readers. It's a team. We should definitely adopt saying that it takes a village to make a webcomic. And with that, I have been your host, Crispy. You can find my work at ghostjunksickness.com.
I am Verathane, and you can find my work at chiralt.sevensmith.net or at witchwoodcomic.com.
I'm Delphina, and you can find my work at zombulus.com.
And I am Claire, and you can find my work at phantomarine.com.
Who's excited for editing?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Right? It's going to be so good.
Thank you so much for listening to Screen Tones. Please subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to also follow us on Twitter at ScreenTonesCast.